For years, Oleg Gordievsky fed MI6 classified information whilst becoming a rising star in the KGB. His shadowy and deceptive life shut out those closest to him, and nobody knew he was about to betray his motherland. His life and times read as a thrilling movie script, but the story of Gordievsky is 100% real. Born Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky on October 10, 1938 in Moscow, Russia, Oleg was set up for success. His father was an NKVD officer, the department that handled internal affairs. This department would later become the infamous KGB. The two departments, whilst officially tasked with intelligence and state security, colloquially became known as the secret police. If you were a dissident, political adversary, or just someone the state didn't like, seeing the men in suits driving a Volga was a terrible sign. Thanks in part to the NKVD and KGB, ordinary Russians began to self-censor and keep their opinions to themselves. This forced political movements and opposition underground. Through fear, they would disappear next. With his father being an NKVD officer, Oleg was poised to take up the mantle. He attended good schools, where it was clear he had all the makings of an intelligence officer. His teachers remarked that he was very intelligent, with a sharp memory and a knack for learning languages. Before attending university, Oleg had already learnt German, a very useful language given what was happening in Berlin at the time. His intelligence and father's rank gained him a spot at the prestigious Moscow University before moving over to the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. This latter was and still is run by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At this school, Oleg and some of the Soviet Union's brightest minds were trained to be the next generation of spies and secret police. Though we do not know exactly what he studied, it is clear that Oleg learned the ins and outs of espionage. It was also here he learned Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, in accompaniment to his proficiency in German and Russian. His tutors laid out a bright future for Oleg, but little did they know that he would betray them in the most shocking way possible. The cracks begin to form. Shortly after graduating, Oleg took his first posting in East Berlin in 1961. 1961 was a crucial year, not just for the Soviet Union, but for Europe as a whole. Post-war Germany was a shadow of its former self. The country had been divided into 4 sections, each administered by a different entity. Berlin, Germany's capital, had also been divided. West Berlin was occupied and administered by the UK, US, and France. West Berlin was seen as the progressive and promising part of Germany, one that respected democracy and individual freedoms. Meanwhile, East Berlin was occupied and administered by the Soviet Union in its conquest to spread communism into Europe. The subjects were now under Soviet control, or at least German forces with Soviet backing. The partition of East Germany is where the Iron Curtain began to form. East Germany was proving a very difficult place to live. Food was scarce, families were surviving on rations, and job opportunities were few and far between. Germany had acquired a lot of debt and reparations post-war, and nowhere felt that burden as hard as East Germany. Seeing their neighbors prosper and live freely in the West, many young people, especially those with higher education and training, fled. This was deeply embarrassing for the Soviet Union, which would not allow failure at any turn. August 13th, 1961, a day that will live on forever. As citizens of East Germany awoke and looked out of their window, they were met with the beginnings of a several feet tall concrete wall laced with barbed wire. The wall had been mostly constructed overnight in secrecy and silence. Guards were now posted at makeshift entrances, and any dreams the citizens had of heading west had been crushed. Behind the scenes, the Russian government had been cooking up this plan for a while. It was only when negotiations broke down that Nikita Khrushchev decided to pull the trigger. Among the sea of KGB officers was Oleg Gordievsky. He later recalled in an interview for The Guardian, quote, "It was an open secret in the Soviet embassy. I was lying in my bed, and I heard the hands going past in the street outside." Gordievsky couldn't believe the USSR's cruel disregard for the East German citizens. The wall had sprung up overnight, separating families and lovers. During his short one-year tenure in East Berlin, Oleg saw great suffering. The building of the wall shattered whatever trust or love he had for the Soviet system. Not knowing what to do next, Oleg returned to Moscow to collect himself. Whilst Oleg did not defect at this time, it's easy to see how the seeds of dissension were being planted in his mind. KGB officer status. Despite his disillusionment with the Soviet Union, Oleg joined the ranks of the KGB in 1963. Maybe it was here that Oleg decided to take the system down from the inside. Who knows? When asked in interviews, Oleg stated he joined the KGB because it offered a rare chance to live abroad. In his 2013 interview with The Guardian, Oleg insisted it had always been his dream to end up in London, but he could not have anticipated what it would cost him to get there. Within months of joining the KGB, Oleg was already climbing the ranks. His superiors saw an intelligent and driven young man, one who was fluent in many languages and in espionage. Within 3 years, Oleg's wish was granted once more when he was sent to work at the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen. His time in Copenhagen was uneventful. He continued to impress the higher ranks and was quickly becoming a trusted confidant. For years, Oleg continued serving the state and became outwardly happy about the role he had carved out for himself. To those around him, Oleg seemed proud to be a KGB officer, serving his motherland, but in his most private thoughts, Oleg wanted out. His hatred for the Soviet state was already burgeoning, but in 1968, this hatred would swell to new heights. The Prague Spring. Sometime in the 1960s, Oleg had got married and was at least trying to live a normal life. He continued his post in Denmark, occasionally returning home for family leave. In the background, the Soviet Union continued to control their Soviet satellite states, although with mixed results. One such nation that was struggling under the Soviet system was Czechoslovakia. Post-war, Czechoslovakia was struggling to find its footing. It had been swallowed up by the Soviet Union, and by the tail end of the 1960s, its citizens were growing tired. The first hit to the Union came when the Slovaks demanded further autonomy. The leadership of Czechoslovakia took a great dislike to this new movement, and despite their best efforts, was not able to give the Slovaks what they wanted. This caused infighting in a country that was already being held together by a thread. Not only did the leadership have to deal with calls for autonomy from the Slovaks, but they were also battling the Czechoslovak youth. The youth wanted better opportunities and were pushing the country toward a more open economy, a direct contradiction to the Soviet system of government control. By 1968, Czechoslovakia had become a pressure cooker of different groups vying for control and freedom. Early that year, leadership changed hands. Those shouting for freedom had won somewhat. This new leadership talked of a more open economy and a freer society. Those who had been arrested, shunned, and exiled for their political opinions and work could now be free. But there was one issue: the Soviet Union. Soviet officials were alarmed by Czechoslovakia's new policies and declarations. Their new way of life directly threatened the Soviet system, and there was only one way to stop them: by force. Oleg Gordievsky had been watching all of this unfold behind the scenes. His rank afforded him some information about what was about to play out. He found himself agreeing with the Czechoslovak leaders and their demands. He also knew how dangerous it was to show them any support, even in quiet moments. In August 1968, the Prague Spring movement was gaining traction. Ordinary citizens took to protesting in the streets. They wanted the Soviets out, or at least out of the way, so that a new way of life could begin. But this was the Soviet Union, a union that was desperate to keep its empire by any means necessary. On August 20th, 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Prague. The new leaders of Czechoslovakia were quietly picked up by the KGB and sent to Moscow to answer for their sins. In the streets, officers tried to quell the dissent as residents slowly began to realize what was happening. The absence of their leaders was not lost on the people. Protests persisted, but so did Soviet forces. By August 27, 1968, the Czechoslovakian leaders capitulated. The dream of socialism with a human face was over. Soviet forces were now to maintain a heavier presence in the country and a firmer grip on their politics. Oleg saw all of this play out in real time, and the crushing of the Prague Spring was the final blow. Oleg ended the 1960s completely disillusioned by the Soviet system. His mission changed. He no longer wanted to serve his country. He wanted to crush it from the inside. A man on the inside. In the 1970s, whilst stationed in Denmark, Gordievsky began sending coded messages and covert signals to both the Danish and British intelligence services. He did this slowly and methodically, knowing that one false move would not only be the end of his career, but his life. In these messages, he stated he would be willing to work for them as their man on the inside. Upon first receiving these messages, MI6 and PET, Denmark's police intelligence service, likewise trod very carefully. These messages could very well have been from a genuine Soviet officer, fed up with the rigid and oppressive system. But they could have also been a trap. By the 1970s, the Cold War was in full effect. The US and Europe were beginning to grow paranoid that the Soviet Union was going to nuke them off the map. Likewise, the Soviets had their suspicions of a similar motive. Whilst little fighting between the parties actually took place, the Cold War was one of the tensest conflicts in history. Every Russian citizen living abroad and those with heritage from any Soviet state were seen as pariahs in their new homeland. Neighbors on both sides of the aisle watched each other closely, listening intently to private conversations through fears they were living with a spy. Amidst this, Oleg Gordievsky had finally managed to convince MI6 he wasn't a Soviet spy prying for classified intel. It was during this time that he was given the infamous codename Sunbeam. His double agent life had now officially begun. Every conversation, every phone call, every swish of a document now held an air of dread. As the years slipped steadily by, Oleg continued passing MI6 information. He kept up appearances, wowing the KGB with his intelligence and language skills. It appears that Danish intelligence authorities did not take an interest in Oleg, but MI6 was enough for him. Living a double life slowly began to take its toll on Oleg. In 1978, his second tenure in Copenhagen was over, dashing his dreams of escaping into the Danish wilderness. He was ordered to return to Moscow to mop up the mess he had made in his personal life. As previously mentioned, Oleg had been married shortly after joining the KGB, but this marriage could not withstand the distance. Whilst he was still married, Oleg took up a mistress, Layla Alavea, and was embroiled in a steamy affair. No longer wishing to be with his wife, who was back home in Moscow, he divorced her. Unfortunately for Oleg, the KGB did not take kindly to divorce and were even more angered by affairs. The KGB likely viewed divorce as shameful, due to it breaking the Soviet societal norm. A happy husband who works hard to provide for his wife, who stays at home with the children and runs the house. Divorce shatters the illusion of family, which was a huge propaganda point for the Soviets. Those within the KGB knew that being recalled to Moscow was a death knell. Either your career was about to take a hit, or you were. Thankfully, Oleg survived his recall to Moscow and went on to marry Layla. In the eyes of the KGB, Oleg was working to repair his sullied image. London calling. For a few years, Oleg laid low in Moscow, turning up to work every day and continuing the illusion of a spy dedicated to the betterment of the motherland. In reality, it was the opposite. The KGB must have seen great promise in him, as in 1982, he was sent to his new post in London. In the years leading up to this move, Oleg had learned English and pushed the KGB hard. The position he sought was empty, and he had proven time and time again that he was a valuable asset. His hard work and lobbying paid off, and now his dreams of a British life were just within reach. Whilst he had been stationed back in Moscow, MI6 decided it was far too risky to continue their agreement. Some have postulated that Oleg's move to London was somewhat facilitated by MI6, thanks to inside interference. This won't be the first time that MI6 plays a hand in Oleg's accession to the top. In London, Oleg continued to wow the KGB, proving that their investment in his education and training had indeed paid off. It didn't take long for Oleg to rise through the ranks, although much of this was aided by MI6. Their underhanded involvement is credited for Oleg's stellar and rapid succession. MI6 also played a few more dirty tricks on the Soviets. In his book, The Spy and the Traitor, the greatest espionage story of the Cold War, author Ben McIntyre details how the British intelligence agency managed to get Oleg's superiors out of his hair. In a move that feels like it has been ripped from a spy thriller, MI6 agents made up rumors and charges against the senior KGB agents stationed in London. When Moscow caught wind of these, the KGB officers were whisked away to Moscow, never to be seen again. During this second stint with MI6, he was codenamed NOCTON. Only those at the very top knew of Oleg's real name and identity, and MI6 worked hard to keep him safe. It's no secret that MI6 and the CIA shared information. The UK and the US have been close allies for many decades, and the two continue their partnership today. Sometime in the mid to 1980s, the CIA caught wind of a high-ranking KGB officer who was willing to betray his country. MI6 did their due diligence and kept his name a secret, even to the CIA. The CIA decided to codename him Tickle. Unbeknownst to Oleg and MI6, somebody in the CIA had it out for Oleg. The CIA's involvement kick-started one of the world's most thrilling escape plans. Oleg Gordievsky, a man from Moscow, was about to become one of the world's most wanted spies. Double agent double-crossed. In 1983, the West, unbeknownst to its citizens at the time, came incredibly close to all-out mutually assured destruction. In November of that year, NATO conducted a military exercise in Germany. For the Soviets, this sent alarm bells ringing. They believed this was a prelude to war, but Oleg managed to convince them otherwise. Oleg notified MI6 that the Soviets were thinking of preemptively striking Europe with a nuclear warhead. He was able to convince the Soviets not to strike, whilst at the same time warning Europe of their plans. Nobody knew it yet, but Oleg had just saved Europe from nuclear annihilation. By April 1985, Oleg's dreams had come true. He was now the so-called resident, better known as the leader of the Soviet embassy in London, and had been successfully passing messages to MI6 without detection for a decade. On May 16, 1985, Oleg received a telegram that made his blood run cold. He had been recalled to Moscow with immediate effect. His work for the Queen and country had left its mark on M16, which not only valued his information, but also his life. They had grown to love Oleg and knew that allowing him to board that plane back to Russia would be his end. His handlers pleaded with him to take up their offers of a safe house and guaranteed defection, but Oleg refused. Everyone around him was confused. He was being given a pass to freedom, but he chose to face the music. This cemented Oleg as a noble and honorable man, one who knew the price he and he alone must pay for his transgressions. Oleg Gordievsky left for Moscow on May 19, 1985. Gordievsky himself believed he would never see London again, but nothing is ever simple when it comes to espionage. Hours after arriving in Moscow, Oleg was whisked away by the KGB, the very men he had stood beside for years. No longer an asset, he was an adversary. For 5.5 hours, his comrades in arms used the techniques he knew so well against him. Not only was he psychologically pushed, but physically too. In interviews, Oleg spoke of being injected with an unknown substance and briefly recalls being plied with alcohol too. As a result, he was unable to think straight and apply his training, but he refused to break. After 5.5 grueling hours without a confession, the leading officer told him he was free to go. But there was one condition: he would never leave Russia again. Oleg knew they were playing games with him. The KGB wanted him to make contact with MI6, so they could catch him in the act and have damning evidence to sign off on his disappearance. Thankfully, Oleg was smart enough to understand what was going on. The Soviets likely thought he would act out in desperation, but perhaps they neglected to realize just how good a spy Oleg was. After several weeks of being watched closely, Oleg didn't want to wait around to find out what they were going to do next. Somehow, whilst under constant KGB surveillance, Oleg was able to make contact with MI6 to put Operation Pimlo into effect. The plan had in fact been drawn up many years earlier, ready and waiting for such a day to come. One evening, Oleg pulled out a note which read, quote, "Appear on a specified street corner on any Tuesday at 7 p.m., carrying a Safeway plastic bag. Wait long enough to be noticed. Make eye contact with a man carrying a Harrods bag who'll be munching food. On the third Sunday after that, pass a written message by brush contact in St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square." It took 2 attempts for Oleg to be able to signal to this mystery man, but finally, MI6 were kicked into high gear and Operation Pimlo was ready to go. Oleg spent his final few days in Russia, clearing out his apartment, sorting his bank accounts. At the time, his wife, Layla, had no idea what was about to unfold. He didn't tell a single soul about his defection. He would have to leave them all behind and hope that the KGB didn't target his family as collateral, but it was a risk he had to take. On a fine July day, Oleg left for his usual afternoon jog. He had been instructed by MI6 to make it to a secluded forest and wait behind a rock. A diaper a day keeps the KGB away. After jogging and running for what felt like forever, Oleg found his meeting spot. He laid down on the ground and hoped that MI6 were not planning on turning him over to the KGB. Every second that passed was agonizing, his heart beating loud enough for him to hear. Every snapped branch or gust of wind frightened Oleg, but he had to keep his resolve. Just before 2:45 p.m. on July 19, 1985, 2 cars containing 4 MI6 officers, 2 male and 2 female. 2 females arrived at the agreed meeting spot. The cars pulled over as though they were taking a rest stop. Whilst the 2 women pretended to stretch their legs, the men bundled Oleg into the boot of one of the cars. To add to his misery, an aluminium blanket was placed over him to throw off infrared heat detectors should they be pulled over. The whole ordeal had lasted mere seconds before the couples got back into their cars and began driving to the Finnish border. Oleg was not out of the woods yet, though, and what happened next feels like it was ripped straight from a James Bond movie. When the car approached the border, Oleg could hear Soviet guards ordering a full search of the car. 4 random British tourists being desperate to enter Finland was more than enough cause for alarm. What MI6 hadn't anticipated at the border were sniffer dogs. In a moment of quick thinking, one of the female agents pulled out her baby and began changing its diaper on the trunk of the car. She acted stressed and thanked the guards for allowing her to do so. After changing the diaper, she dropped the diaper on the ground, just under where Oleg was stashed. Her quick thinking threw off the sniffer dogs and somewhat disgusted the guards. Not wanting to have to search a dirty diaper, the guards waved them through, and Oleg was finally safe. In an interview years later, Oleg remarked, quote, "The trunk was soon opened after entering Finland. I saw blue sky, white clouds, and pine trees above. Thanks to the courage and ingenuity of my British friends, I had outwitted the entire might of the KGB. I was out, I was safe, I was free. The long run to freedom." After entering Finland, MI6 made arrangements for Oleg to be flown to the UK, where he could begin his new life. His new life would also be marked by being surveilled, but this time, it was for his own protection. Once the KGB caught wind of his defection, they were furious and wanted the UK to return him to Russia at once to face punishment. The UK refused, instead opting to strike a deal that would allow his wife and children to join him in the UK. Russia went ahead, charging Oleg in absentia, but the sentence could not be handed down. After years of fighting, the USSR/Russia allowed Layla and their 2 children to join Oleg in the UK. The story didn't end for Oleg in the 80s, though, and he continued to be a dominant voice in counterintelligence circles in the UK. He also met and befriended Alexander Litvinenko, a Russian FSB agent who defected to the UK in the 2000s. Oleg's continued criticism of Russia made him and MI6 paranoid. He had guards with him most of the time, and his private life was kept just that, private. In 2005, Queen Elizabeth II honored Oleg in recognition of his outstanding contribution to protecting the safety and security of the UK. He was very outspoken against Vladimir Putin and maintained that Putin was behind Litvinenko's untimely passing by poison. Oleg would have his own brush with a suspected poisoning in 2007 when he was found unconscious and taken to the hospital. Toxicology tests revealed traces of thallium in his system, a common poison used by the Russian state. Thankfully, Oleg was able to survive this attempt and continued his criticisms and analysis of the Russian state. Who was the man who crossed him and almost cost him everything? Well, that would be Aldrich Ames, an American CIA officer. In the 1980s, Ames became a double agent for the Soviet Union, much like Oleg had done for the UK. All Ames asked in return for this high-level information was $50,000, which is around $150,500 in 2025, adjusted for inflation. Ames was eventually found out by the CIA and was sentenced to life without parole in 1994. He is still alive and is currently serving out his sentence. In 2013, Oleg rang the alarm about more KGB/FSB agents in London. He reported that there were just as many Russian spies active now as there were during the height of the Cold War. The UK has long struggled with Russian spies and has had many international incidents revolving around poisonings. On March 4th, 2025, the unbelievable life of Oleg Gordievsky came to a quiet close. He passed away in his Godalming, Surrey, home in his sleep. He had lived under a pseudonym for many years, and those around him had no idea they were in the presence of one of the Cold War's most daring spies. No fanfare, no media surge, no state funeral, just a quiet end to what had been an extraordinary life. Oleg Gordievsky's name may not be known by many, but his selfless actions have definitely left their mark on the UK.